I'm also joined today by my fellow colleague, Tara Perrin. She might be helping me watch chat as well. So please do feel free to post questions in the chat. We'll take care of those as we go throughout. And thank you all for being here. Today's topic is about providing meaningful and timely feedback in online courses. As I'm sure you're all aware, we like to encourage feedback, and trying to figure out how to best provide that is a way that we will get started. And so that is the focus of our session today. This is what's known as a SPARK workshop. MTSU Online provides professional development in a variety of areas where we try to highlight strategies, practices, resources, all leading to quality. That's what the SPARK stands for. So we will get started. And here are our session objectives for today. Again, we like to start off by thinking about what is the purpose of what we're doing and how we're going to get about that. So we're going to start today by defining some components of what we call the POPSTAR feedback model. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but there are also some other feedback models that we'll talk about that might be better suited for your purposes as you think about how you want to reach your students and or how your students can engage with each other. We will talk about some practical feedback strategies where you are using them to meet regular and substantive interaction. We'll talk a little bit about what those guidelines are and why it's important and how feedback fits into that. And then lastly, we'll talk about some tools or some templates or some ideas that you might provide to think about how you are providing meaningful and impactful feedback as we get going. If you have any questions throughout this, please do put those in chat or feel free to unmute and use your mic or video or whatever to ask questions. Happy to go through that. Hoping that we'll have some good conversation as we get through this. So when we're talking about feedback, we're always talking about the whys of why are we doing things, how are we doing things, and why it's important to think about feedback as a critical element in your course. And so, what we have learned from the research is really that, first of all, feedback helps establish connection and presence. We want to make sure that our students are feeling like they are part of a group, that they have connected with you as the instructor. But it's also one of those ways that you can provide evidence as an instructor that your students are seen and heard, that their input is valued, and that their learning is valued. We also talk about feedback and being a contributor to increasing persistence. As we all know, we do not live in a silo, and we want to make sure that our students can feel reassured that they're on the right track, that they are doing the things that they need to be doing. That helps with persistence because, again, hopefully it gets a little bit of motivation behind them. But also, if they are struggling, you have a way to encourage your students to continue their efforts, to keep trying, that they have it within them. They have that agency to make sure that they can get through their own learning processes. And then the last piece that we talk about is feedback that you'll see in the research is that how it supports learning. And when you have well structured and meaningful feedback, you can begin to identify both the strengths where things are going well, but also where areas can be improved in terms of performance or going towards those that mastery of the objectives, those learning objectives that you've put forth. And so we talk about using feedback to really support learning at a deeper, engaged level. And you can also, again, reinforce learning through referencing resources or some other corrective actions as you're working through that. So, again, there are a lot of research out there about the importance of feedback, and hopefully you found some of those to be true as well, that you've heard back from your students that you are also receiving feedback about how class is working. So it's kind of a two-way street there. But what we're going to be talking about today is particularly about how you as an instructor can deliver feedback in a timely and meaningful way so that your students are getting the most out of it, so that the learning can continue at a deeper level. All righty. Moving into it, again, we are talking initially about feedback frameworks because some people are a little cautious about how do I even do feedback? How can I even get started? We talk about frameworks. So, what we're presenting to you is a couple of different frameworks that hopefully you can pull out of what you feel is appropriate for your own teaching expertise and things like that. The first one that we're going to talk about is the POPSTAR model of feedback, and this was something that our very own Tara Perrin, she's on the call as well today. She came up with this acronym to help describe the approach of how you might structure your feedback so that it is meaningful and intentional. So we'll go through the elements. The POP portion of POPSTAR feedback is really stands for positive, opportunity, and positive. As we think about how you structure your feedback, the first thing that we want to do is, again, get off on the right foot. So think about the positive aspects. Begin your feedback with something that was done well or something that was good about the work that your student has done. This primes them to be ready to hear and be ready to intake and interact with that feedback. The next is the O, that opportunity. Once you have been positive, started off with a positive note, you can then start to present ideas about where students can grow or where they can improve in their knowledge and skill. And so thinking about where are those opportunities for growth, but also what have those opportunities for mastery been? Where have they gotten it right? And then we talk about structuring it as a closing, concluding your feedback with encouragement so that they are inspired to continue their efforts and their actions. So, as we talked about with feedback being a reinforcement and uh, persistence motivator, this is how you can do that. So, the pop elements are kind of the overarching structure: positive, presenting the opportunity, and then closing with positive statements and making that available. The star is actually that part of the feedback model really talks a little bit more about some of those important elements within those opportunity areas. So you want to make sure that your feedback is specific. Providing specific details can give your students a lot more focus on a particular result. So think about what are they doing well, being specific about that, not just a hey, great job, but you did this well, you did that well. And then also being specific about where they need to be make improvements and thinking about that. The T is about timely. How do you how frequently do you give feedback, and making sure that you're giving feedback in a timely manner or a quick manner so that your students actually can review the information, take it in, think about it, but then apply it to a suggested improvement. So thinking about how they can use the feedback to make improvements. A stands for actionable. How can you make that feedback a little bit more actionable, meaning requiring your students to do something with it? So give them some actions to take or provide some calls to action so that they know what they must do to make improvements or to make different elements stand out for them. And then last is R, being respectful. I think we all are at that stage where the way that you approach someone and give feedback, you want to make sure that you are being respectful because you are fostering a professional, kind learning tone. We really want our students to feel like they're seen and valued, to understand that we are understanding and empathetic with them. So you can demonstrate that by validating their effort, acknowledging their feelings, and along those lines. And again, reinforcing that they have the ability to do the work. And so when you think about the star elements, again, it's a little bit more specific about what you can include and how you frame your pop star feedback, how you frame your feedback. Any questions about the POPSTAR model? Again, I've got an example that's coming up next, but feel free to ask questions. And Tara, if you have any other specifics, please do share those with us as well, because again, you were the one who brought this to life. So here's an example that uses the POPSTAR model, and I'm going to give you about a minute or two to read through it so that you can kind of see what and try to identify what those elements of the POPSTAR feedback model look like in action. So hopefully you've had a chance to read through this example. This was something that came up as a lab report response to a science lab. And so again, if we were to go through it and to identify some of those structures using the POPSTAR model, sorry, it's going to flash on your screen here for just a minute. The idea is that, again, we notice that it starts off as positives. You say to your student, nice work on your lab report. Again, reinforcing that there is something that they have done well. And it starts off on the tone like, okay, somebody's actually read my thing and think that I'm doing okay. And then it moves into an opportunity or being specific about what you as the instructor have seen and what you might then call out as an opportunity for improvement. In this case, it was consider how you might refine your data analysis and discussion to more specifically describe what could be strengthened by more direct comparison. So again, putting it into specifics that it's a discussion, you might refine your data analysis, that element of a lab report, being specific about that, but also what's the opportunity? How might they refine that? And then we also talk about it, kind of closing out the idea of um, being positive, I believe your understanding and skills will be deepened. You are giving agency to that student that they have the ability to do this. The last parts are timely and call to action. You can see that this instructor has said, please actually do something with this feedback. Revise version, submit it back to me, incorporating the changes. So you're asking your students to take action and to do it in a quick time frame so that it doesn't just languish and people don't know what to do with all of that. And then lastly, I look forward to your continued progress. So again, thinking about being respectful throughout all of it, but also at the end, kind of going back to that positive piece, where again, I am interested in your learning. I am interested in understanding and seeing what you can do with this. And with the feedback you've provided as the instructor, what can you do with it? How much further can you go with it to reinforce their learning? Again, you've identified gaps. In this one, it's very specific about which gaps might need to be addressed. And again, thinking about, okay, so how could they actually do that? Providing a little bit of insight into that and making it actionable. I feel like that's some of the missed opportunities that we sometimes see with giving feedback is that we don't ask our students to do anything with it. We ask them to take it in and reflect upon it internally, but what can we do to provide it back to us so that we can see the evidence that they have taken it, they've modified their learning to think about it differently. So again, the POPSTAR model, thinking about positive, start off positive, provide that opportunity, wrap up in a positive way, thinking about the specific actions that an individual could take, timely fashion, get the feedback back to them in a time so that they can actually reflect upon it, but do something more with it. And that's where the actionable part comes in. And then lastly is respectful. Again, identify where are they doing great and how can you reinforce that with that respectful tone that you appreciate their effort, that their ability is good. They are trying to work on that to make that happen. Any questions about PopStar feedback at this time? Switching through some screens. And I see that Tara has absolutely talked about feedback is considered regular and substantive interaction because, again, we need to ensure that our students know that we are there as their professors and present in their learning. It's a critical point. Okay. I'm going to move on to a next model because again, I feel like there are 3 different models that we'll talk about in this presentation, but it's important to have these different elements because again, this one might speak to you in one way. The other ones that we're going to talk about might speak to you in other ways. And we just are going to say, go with what works for you. Feel free to mash these up. But the important part is to get the feeling of what good feedback looks like. So the 2 alternative models of feedback that we have come across again in the literature, primarily more from, I'll say, a psychology-based perspective, is the RISE model of feedback and the WISE model of feedback. They all have very similar acronyms because I feel like, again, there are consistent elements throughout that. But that idea of with RISE, you're going to have a little bit of a different focus on how you are providing feedback. So when you're thinking about feedback with the RISE model, you're going to ask your students to first reflect on their work. How is it going for them? What did they do to get to the space they're in? The I stands for inquire. So you ask questions of your students to ask them about their process. How did they get there? So you're asking them to really think about um, what steps they took and evaluating those. The S stands for suggest. This is what, again, similar to the specific and the opportunities, where you are suggesting and making specific suggestions for improvement or reinforcing specific areas that are important. The last is E for elevate. Again, going back to that positive element, the elevate in this particular model talks about how you encourage higher level thinking skills or deeper involvement or engagement in the course. And so when you look at this model, again, it's going to have a little bit of a different feel to it. Again, where you're asking first to reflect on their work, then inquire, ask clarifying questions, suggesting, making specific suggestions, and then lastly, elevating and encouraging. The WISE model, I'm going to switch over to that one, and then we're going to go through a couple of examples. It works a little bit similarly in terms, again, you're going to see some synonyms for lots of words, but it has a little bit more of a reference to um, an inclusive pedagogy, the idea of how can you bring in more of the individual into this, as well as a broader perspective. And so with the WISE model, you start off with what went well. Again, you're identifying those strengths and successes. What's gone well with what the work is that they've done, ask them to identify their own strengths and successes. And then the I is identifying areas for improvement, thinking about, again, more specifics on where the area for improvement needs to happen by clearly pointing out um, in those elements. The S stands for suggestions for the future. Again, thinking about this may not be something that you ask them to turn back in, but to think about how it makes connections into the next elements of the course or into other areas of the course. And so suggestions for the future and maybe providing some advice on how to complete those future tasks. So again, thinking about what is this particular assignment? What can they transfer from this assignment to another or to a professional goal? Where are they going to see it out in the wild, so to speak? And then the last one is to evaluate. And in this case, you're evaluating overall performance by offering some insights into your grade, your final judgment, so to speak, the summary of your feedback and how you arrived at the score. I know some faculty are a little bit concerned about having to explain, how they arrived at a score, but if you could give some further evidence that evaluates overall performance, based upon everything that you have said in your feedback, this is how you arrived at that score, that rationale. I think students will take that a little bit easier. So again, these are two other models alternative to POPSTAR. The RISE model, reflect, inquire, suggest, and elevate. The WISE model, what went well, identifying areas for improvement, suggestions for future provision, and evaluate overall performance. So what those look like in action, I'm going to start with the RISE model first. And again, this is another long one. I've tried to color code this time rather than put things off, so I'll give you a minute to read through that one. So as you can see with this RISE model, again, you're starting off with a reflection piece, um, reflecting upon what they have done well. Inquire, you'll see that there are questions in the middle of the feedback statement. You know, what was the significance? Asking your students to reflect upon their learning as well. Did you think it was an error or not? The suggestions, what would they do next? What could they do differently? Try to include a brief paragraph. That's what the feedback says. And then the last one, that elevate statement, thinking about why it's important and how this then reinforces that you're working on your learning along those ways. So that is an example of the RISE model. Again, reflect, inquire, suggest, and elevate. And then move on to the WISE model. I know, all the fun things. We love a good acronym. A little bit longer, as you can see, and I'll have to give you a minute to look at that one. As you can see with the WISE model, again, starts off with that what went well, effectively summarized, and it was very specific. It's a table that was well organized, not clearly labeled, not just a, hey, congratulations, you did great. It's very specific. The improvement, noticing, the inconsistencies, how do you then impact, how does that then impact? And then the suggestions, next report, again, connecting on into that next future opportunity, how they could take what is going on now and apply it to the next uh, activity, assignment, things like that. And then last one is evaluate. Again, it's an overall summarizing of what was good, but also then how to take that to the next level, to continue why it's important, as particularly in the sciences, as this one says, becoming a more independent researcher. So as you are thinking about your feedback and what you are providing to your students, it is something that, again, gets a little bit, depending upon your needs, you may have something that uses the WISE model, where you are looking at a little bit broader perspective with that last evaluation piece. You might use the POPSTAR model. Again, it's a little bit more specific and focused, but it also has a different rhythm to it. And then the RISE model. Are there any questions about those models at this point? And just to follow up on that, Matt, and your comment in the chat area, this is a little bit of a visual breakdown, so to speak, or a comparison of these three different models. With POPSTAR, again, if you think about the primary focus, it's balanced, encouraging, actionable. With the RISE model, it's a little bit more reflective because it has the inquiry elements in it, but also perhaps the higher order thinking skills because you are asking them to think beyond specific tasks. And then the WISE model is a little bit more of a comprehensive evaluation because it does try to bring it all together as a focus for that. When we think about how it's best used, when we think about where would I use this best? Well, we talk about POPSTAR being about formative assessment because you are talking about making it actionable and thinking about how it's connecting. So your formative assessment is really where you are trying to say, okay, you're still working on it. How can this be improved next time? Keep moving on that one. With the RISE model, it started off actually as being a model for peer review. And so again, you could ask your students to provide students, a peer review activity to make that happen and use that RISE model. And it is about metacognition because you do ask them to think about their thinking. How did you get there with that inquiry element? With WISE, again, that summative assessment, maybe this is something at the end of an assessment of a learning outcome to see if it's something that, how it connects to the next, their professional goals and things like that. The strength of PopStar, you do have an overall tone. It feels a little, I'm going to say it feels a little friendlier just because it doesn't have as many formal elements to it. With the RISE model, it really is more about student agency and ownership. How are the students taking control of their own learning? What are they contributing? How are they going to think about that and make that happen? And then with WISE, again, I feel like it's very um, definitional and clear on what those specific elements are. It seems to be a little bit more in that lane. The challenge with them is that I think it can be a little bit of a challenge to think about what can I say in the pop star model? How do I get to positives when sometimes our students are, it's a challenge to find the positives. Uh, so how do you put the intentional effort behind that? With the RISE model, again, if you're focusing on metacognition, you may not feel like a direct connection is made. So you want to think about that. Also, if it's peer review, using the RISE model for peer review, ensuring that the students are really thinking one-on-one. How is this, this is one person, not a group activity. And then the whys can feel a little less personal because you are trying to, again, think that bigger picture along the way. So again, you will get a copy of these slides and to think about them going forward. But these are the three areas, the three models of feedback framework that we wanted to introduce to you so that you have some ideas about, okay, so how could I possibly structure meaningful and intentional feedback so that I can get my students a little bit further down the path with their learning. All of these models do aim to improve learning by providing a structure and to offer that actionable insight. I think it was mentioned in chat about, the call to action, really having your students work with the feedback that they receive. Not only helps you, again, confirm for you as the instructor, yes, they've actually received the feedback, I've done, that next step, but that they actually have taken it to heart and are able to practice and apply with it. Hopefully that gives a little bit more of a guide to the learning that they're doing. So those are the three models that we're going to go. And next, we're going to head into some strategies. And again, I'll pause and just kind of ask a question about, do you feel like you would use any of those models or have you used those models? Please put a response in chat or feel free to unmute yourself. All right, we'll head into the application part. So let's talk about strategies. Because these models can be applied with any type of delivery, then we start to talk about some other strategies of, okay, so how might I actually accomplish giving my students feedback? And as we know, we have systems and technologies that can help us. So to think about um, how do I make my presence as an instructor felt and known as part of the RSI elements? That we are ensuring that there is regular interaction between students and instructors. So feedback is one of those 5 elements. And so when we start to talk about how does feedback reveal itself, one of the strategies we talk about is providing personalized audio and video feedback. Um, the learning management system that we currently have and the one that we're moving to in the future does have the capability to record audio feedback and video feedback when you're grading assignments. Um, I think that that can be really helpful in humanizing the experience of feedback, both for you and for your students. As the instructor, I think we're often trying to set the tone and try to emphasize specific elements. So, using an audio or video feedback might give that a little bit more effort in doing and setting that tone because you can hear and you can see more of those elements. But we also think about it as a way that it can personalized to the student that they are being heard as well, because there is something that it seems a little bit more personal than text. You might also be meeting your students' needs in a little bit better way because they might do better with audio processing or visual processing of feedback compared to text. So you can think about it also meeting some universal design for learning opportunities as well. If you have not explored the audio and video feedback options in D2L or other learning management systems, please do let us know. We are happy to provide some information and instruction, but it's in the grades area when you go to assess either Dropbox assignments or discussion boards. There will be a record audio or record video button that you can use, and then you can just go ahead and do that. If you like, as we think about this, you could actually write down your feedback in the POPSTAR model, in a RISE model, in a WISE feedback, and then record that. So you don't have to be off the cuff on camera if you don't want to be, or on microphone if you don't want to be. You could actually craft your feedback initially first and then record it as if you were doing, just a reading of what you've said. But I find that it's helpful to not just kind of go into your feedback cold, but to think about what am I going to say? How am I going to structure it to make sure that I'm getting those meaningful feedback options going in there, specific tasks and things like that. We also talk about a strategy being peer review. And I know that this can be a little bit of a challenge, but to think about structured peer review feedback activities as another way of, I'll say, triangulating the data, where your students could get feedback from each other in addition to you. And we like the idea of structured peer feedback because it gives more specific details about how people might go about learning. And so if you think about a peer feedback activity in your course, students are learning from each other, and you as the instructor would also be getting insights about where learning is occurring or where there might be some gaps. And in the learning management system, the best way to set up a peer review activity is to use the groups function and to think about a group discussion board where the groups are teamed up or paired up to comment on each other's work. And I would also give them the frameworks to say that they need to provide feedback in using either, the POPSTAR model or the RISE model. I think the WISE model might be a little bit far out there for them because again, they're learning. They might not know all those things about, sort of the broader picture of how things connect. But we know our students can ask questions of each other, that they can help out thinking as they're going through that. So thinking about a peer review activity where feedback can be made meaningful, they could hear it from their fellow students, but they could also hear it from you as the instructor because you would go in and add additional commentary to that as well. And then the last type of a strategy that we often hear about are feedback loops. So if you can offer some short, ungraded comprehension checks, knowledge checks, or consider having a reflection piece embedded in an assignment where your students can really do have a checkpoint on their learning. When you build those in from the get-go, I think it starts to create an environment where you're asking your students to reflect upon their learning, but also to take the information and do something with it. And so when we talk about feedback loops, we're really kind of talking about some easy things that you can do that don't require grading, that you are doing knowledge checks, things like muddiest point, at the end of a concept, at the end of a lesson, at the end of the day, asking your students to provide you with information about what they still have questions about. What is the muddiest point? What are they not clear about? Um, the idea of the 1-minute paper at the end where you ask your students to summarize what they have learned that day, then you can again go through and identify the specifics or where gaps might be made or might have occurred. The last one is again thinking about what kind of questions could you ask on an assignment that would maybe reflect upon the learning that they're doing. So I know that when people are doing assignments, they're talking about the mechanics and they're talking about the specifics of here's what you need to do to demonstrate learning. Make sure that you fill out this lab report, make sure that you complete this quiz, make sure that you, craft this paragraph, craft this essay. But you might also throw in a question that asks them to be reflective. Okay, so you've just written this essay. What did you think about the learning experience? What did you think about um, how you arrived at your steps or your conclusions, those process pieces? Again, that goes a little bit towards the wise and the rise models, where you're talking about that reflection, that metacognition piece, and then you can actually give further more specific feedback because you know how they have thought along the way to get to where they're at. And we talk about including it as part of an assignment because it doesn't seem like it's an extra, that it is intentional, that you want to know about what your students are, how they're feeling, how they're learning, how they're assessing their own progress. So that again, you can help them, guide them to resources or guide them to, yay, congratulations, you did it. Let's get some, agency, you've motivated, continuing to reinforce those pieces. So those are 3 strategies that we have talked about in terms of how to give feedback and making it a little bit more intentional, how you bring that into the learning space, so to speak, doing that more personalized feedback, peer review opportunities, and feedback loops. Any questions about those particular strategies?
There's a question in the chat about if you have any insight to student preferences or what they're more likely to
Mm,
respond to review and respond to.
good question. Um, I think I have since I have not taught in a classroom in a while, what I have read, and you all can have conversations about what you're experiencing. I think when students have something to do that's actionable, I think also that um, the POPSTAR model has some really good elements to it because I feel like that gives students, I don't know, I think the tone is important. And that's more evident in the pop star model. Tara, do you have any thoughts?
Honestly, not particularly. You did a really good job. So
Thank
I
you.
appreciate that. But that is that is an important part of the model and something that I intentionally, very much intentionally think about is tone, because it has been my experience, and I can only speak from my experiences on this, that tone really helps students respond. So somehow setting a positive tone that almost tries to build a connection while still being evaluative and being very specific about what they should do or what they need to think about in order to get to that step, that that place that you want the student to be.
And I feel like, again, if you're more specific, that students aren't left in the dark or they're not wandering around trying to figure out what exactly did you mean by that? Or, you said something about XYZ. Well, I'm not really quite clear on XYZ to begin with. So what can I do with that? I feel like there's also an element in here more that I know that I struggled with, was the what is that next step that the student should take, and being more specific about that. Trying to think about what are the resources that are available to students so that they have that next step, and how could they actually demonstrate that they took that next step to me, as the instructor, to know that they've actually taken in the feedback, and are able to practice and apply with it. um, I think the other part, and maybe this is something that we all can have some comments about, but the idea of, do students know how to use feedback? Are they familiar with what feedback is supposed to do? Just as we have conversations about how do I get my students to have, meaningful discussion in their online classes, we think about, or how to use office hours appropriately or effectively. We think about that our students may not have had experiences where they've received feedback. And so we might also want to kind of step back from an assignment or something like that, to talk a little bit more about what is the purpose of feedback and what should they do with it? Can we offer them any guidance for that? Because I feel like, at a certain level, people think about feedback as being, oh, you're just hating on me. You're just, I can't do anything right. I'm not good. I'm not anything like that. I'm only going to get negative comments, and I don't even, I just don't even know what to do with it. And so when I think about, maybe there's another piece at the start of the semester that talks about, or you walk through an example of how do you use feedback. Um, you know, Providing personal examples, I think is helpful because it helps, your students kind of like, oh, that's how I'm supposed to use this. I don't know. That's one of the things that I think comes up a little bit with students, just like, oh yeah, I read it. Okay, didn't I do what I was supposed to do? Or okay, I see that I did something wrong, and now what? So that leading to the next step might be a little bit more, um, um, evident to your students to figure out how to use feedback effectively. Ah, good point in the chat about knowing what you want as an instructor. Being clear on your objectives, and or being clear about what you are seeing, and whether it is matching those expectations or not. Because again, I feel like, there is that opportunity that maybe we aren't as clear in what we're looking for. We know it when we see it. That seems to be the party line. But to figure out then, okay, but how can I explain that to a student? And if it's examples, great, provide them. If you need to have one-on-one conversations with students, again, we talk about meeting the students where they're at. And so it might be that what you say in text or what you say in a video or audio recording doesn't quite hit them. And so we all know that to learn, you might need to hear things multiple times in multiple ways. So thinking about how that can go through, um, in different aspects. Good point. Other thoughts on strategies or things along those nature? And I'll just ask you all now. It's your turn. What kinds of things have you done, to provide feedback? Have you come across any specific tips or tricks that you're willing to, share with us, in a variety of ways? Because I feel like, we all have strengths and abilities, and we don't know what we're going to encounter, in our daily lives about where feedback can be offered. And I often think about it as it doesn't have to be just about assignments in the assessment area. You can provide feedback at any time as throughout your course. Um, I feel like that might also be an opportunity that people haven't necessarily taken advantage of. I'm going back through the comments in chat. Um, thank you. It can be challenging to find a positive thing. And so to think about, again, what are the words that you can use, and how you might go about what is the thing? Well, first of all, they've submitted, they've opened themselves to learning. They're still in it. I think that's a positive aspect. Um, and then you start to move into more about um, specifics about how things might happen. Getting students to read the feedback. Again, I feel like that's something that we might have to teach. Just here's what the steps are. How you actually do that. Mm, Good points are being made in the chat um, about giving students opportunities to explain further about their process before actually giving a final grade or an evaluative mark along those ways, so that you can get some clarification. And I feel like that's an important part too, because again, learning is an ongoing cycle. That idea of we're never done. And so if you think that there are things that could be clearer, absolutely have that conversation with your students, because you just don't know where they are with that particular aspect. Excuse me. Mm, yep. And again, building in ways to make students take action. Great ideas. Tara, could you talk a little bit more about extra credit um, in terms of implementing feedback? How do you work on that?
So what I typically do is once I give them feedback, and I do give extensive feedback, once I give extensive feedback, I tell them in the feedback itself if they implement what I'm asking. I'm very specific. Sometimes I give them examples or I give them leading questions. That if I see that in their next assignment, that implementation, I'll give them extra credit for that. Now it's not much extra credit. It's only a point because I don't want it to be ridiculous. And I do give them about 4 opportunities for that throughout the semester. Um, if they look like they've read the feedback and they're trying to implement the feedback, I give them the point, because then I feel like it's on me to explain a little bit better about how to implement the feedback. That somewhere I missed the mark on that a little bit. So as long as I see the effort, that's what's important to me to get that point. But as I said at the start of the semester, I really talk about feedback and why it's so important that they read it, why it's important that they get it, to think about it in positive, constructive ways. It's not a negative thing, and that remind them that you constantly get feedback in the work world all the time. So you have to be comfortable with getting feedback. So I connect it particularly since many of the students are adult students or older students. I try to connect it to that employment process as well, because again, we don't work in a vacuum and we do get feedback all the time. So you have to get comfortable not only with getting it, but at some point, usually giving it as well. So think of it in those terms, and not just, I've done bad. Somehow I've just done bad. So those are kind of the ways I try to set it up. Um, yeah.
Awesome. Well, and I think again, part of what I think we're discovering is that what you say in feedback can be massaged in a variety of ways so that you can actually get more interaction and more connection. And someone brings up about the time it takes to give feedback and to think about where are you expending your energies and how does that work? What are your all thoughts on the idea of feedback takes a lot of time? Yes, no, maybe?
I'll say yes. I'll also say, by the way, that because I'm adjuncting, I'm not doing this at the scale that other faculty are. I have the luxury, and I do see it as a luxury, of having more time to be dedicated to being able to give feedback to students. I mean, I see that as a luxury because time is really, we're really spread thin when it comes to time in all facets. Um, so I see that as a luxury for me
Mhm.
because it does take a lot of time. I spend a lot of time grading.
And I know that is a concern, about how to do things. And so, um, again, not necessarily part of this presentation, but um, the idea of what are some of the shortcuts that you could include for yourself but still making it meaningful. Thinking about the phrases that you use. We know that there are people who create what they call feedback dictionaries or feedback banks. Um, where you've got comments from previous or other assignments that you have kind of have stored up in a Word document or someplace else where you can just kind of pull that information. What we would say is probably what we would say with if you use AI, generative AI, is the idea is sure use it as to spark some ideas, but make sure that you then go edit and that you then review it to make it more specific to the individual student that you're dealing with at that point. Because the idea is that you want to give feedback that is meaningful and intentional. And sometimes when we start to pull from our feedback loops or feedback banks of, these are generic comments, it doesn't feel personalized. It doesn't feel like it fits the situation. And so, again, we would want you to say, yeah, use the tools that will help you get started, but then also think about it's not a one size fits all and to be more specific because again you are talking about a one-to-one relationship with your student and is that student specific learning path that you're trying to help them. So yeah, the idea of some shortcuts to get you started, maybe that helps you, but then don't rely upon it as the well, I just copied and pasted from the 600 other times I've used this, but to think about what it means in that specific case. We are not opposed to using things like generative AI. Just again be aware of its challenges, whether it comes to intellectual property, thinking about FERPA, about the statements it makes, are they actually true, the hallucinations that come about it, but to think about where can you find some efficiencies but still maintain the meaningfulness, the intentionality behind it. Um, you know, it's challenging. We know the time, as Tara says, we're all faced by the challenge of time. So, um, other thoughts or other comments about feedback? If there's one thing that you will take from this presentation, what would it be? What can you use right now? Thank you all for sharing in in the comments. Much appreciated. I'm glad that this is finding a way that makes something useful to you, and trying to figure out how this all kind of comes together. And again, the idea of these sessions is to identify some strategies, identify some practices, some resources, to help you get into some higher quality learning opportunities and engagement opportunities with your students, to make that happen. Are there any other questions? I know that we're kind of coming up to time, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but please know that you will get a copy of these slides with these links to some different resources that are available to you from a variety of things. So including the RISE model, the WISE model, and more specifics about how to do things like peer review or some of the other feedback in our current learning management system. But hopefully you've gotten some good information out of that. And I'm going to stop the recording for now, unless somebody's got anything else at this point. And then we are open to other questions, whether it's regardless about feedback or not. But we're good to hang out on the line for here just a little bit.